Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kearney's Future of High Tech webinar. My name is Bharat. I'm a partner with Kearney based in the Silicon Valley office. I focus a lot on high tech and semiconductors, and that's the reason I'm your host today. Today, we are going to talk about a very topical topic that's been in the press, I guess, for the last 2-3 years. In my 30 years or so career, I haven't seen so much being talked about semiconductors as has been talked in the last 2 years. Surprisingly, a 6 o'clock news even wanted to talk about that. But anyway, that's not why we are here, but we'll talk about a few other things, mostly from a technical science and physics angle. First of all, we'll try to figure out how did we get here, what the future looks like, and then we'll talk with Debo, who's our esteemed guest today, about what the future looks like, how can we really change it. So before we get started, I would like to introduce Debo, my friend, who's our esteemed guest today. Debo is the CEO and co-founder of a Berkeley-based stealth company. I'll leave it to him how much he wants to share about that. When I heard what he was doing, it just sent shivers up my spine. It was really, really cool. So I thought maybe everybody else gets to hear what Debo and his team are doing. It's a real paradigm shift. Debo is a Cornell physicist by trade or education, but he's an entrepreneur at heart. He's got a lot of other sides to him, but we'll leave that for a different time, some music and all. I'm really excited to have Debo introduce you to you and listen to his views on the semiconductor industry and its future. Debo, welcome.
Thank you, Bharat. Good to be here.
Thank you. Logistics-wise, you can post your questions and we'll take them around the topics that we are discussing, but they will leave a lot of time towards the end for you to actually go through your questions. I know people will have a lot. So Debo, first of all, the hottest question, and you know, this question has been asked. I don't know if I collected a cent, I would become a billionaire by now. How did we get here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I'll try to give kind of three perspectives or three paths. So one that I think everyone is familiar with is the idea that Moore's law scaling is kind of stalling for kind of fundamental technical limits. So the way we get Moore's law is that we shrink transistors. We pack as many transistors on a chip as we can, and as we shrink transistors, we're able to pack more, and we get better, faster, cheaper computers. We get smartphones that are as powerful as the computers that took us to the moon, actually a million times more powerful. And so that game has been played for 50 years and has actually created the information revolution that we see. But as you start to make these transistors smaller, you run into technical challenges that make it harder and harder to continue to just directly play that game to get Moore's law. So it's just getting harder from a technical standpoint to get Moore's law the conventional way. And that difficulty translates to the first thing is a technical thing. Then that difficulty translates into a CapEx issue, because as you make these things smaller, you have to buy really, really expensive lithography machines. Each EUV machine is like $200 million, $200 million. And to build a 3-nanometer fab, you're talking about $10 to $20 billion of investment. And so there's Moore's law, but there's Moore's second law, or Rock's law, which says that the fab is going to double in costs every 4 years, something like that. And that's holding true. So because of the way we get performance, we're now in a position where the CapEx is so prohibitive that only a very small number of companies can afford it. And what then happened is that the countries that were willing to invest and subsidize and kind of play this big CapEx game were the ones that were able to actually sustain kind of their position. And so we find ourselves in a position where the only places in the world today that can actually invest $20 billion to build a fab and have the most advanced fabs are South Korea and Taiwan. and all of the kind of US-based capability, the Western capability, has consolidated into smaller number of companies. Fabs have shut down, and it's directly related to this exponentially exploding capex, and the response of you could say the response of the public sector, the response of the government to this exploding capex. And so now you go from a technical problem to a capex problem, which leads to consolidation of the industry, and then you get to a geopolitical problem because as it happens, the the countries that I mentioned that have these fabs are quite close to China, which is which has interesting relationships with the U.S. So I think that's kind of at a 10,000-foot level, the journey that got us here is that it starts actually with a technical reason for, you're getting diminishing returns from doing Moore's law the same way. It's getting really expensive, and whenever things get expensive, you get consolidation. And if you don't have the government to kind of step in and subsidize or help, then you'll have only certain governments do that, and then you'll end up in this kind of geopolitically challenged situation, and also a very fragile supply chain.
Thank you, Debo. That
It's
kind of
it's a fun time to to be alive in semiconductors.
yes, it is. And that segues into my next question. Look, if you look at the last few decades or so, right, the superpower status was generally driven by either economics or who had the biggest military or the most powerful military.
Yeah.
And what happened that the biggest economies somehow managed to lose their dominance in semiconductors. And I'm kind of alluding to US given the topic being stateside, but then Japan is not far behind. These two used to be the leading semiconductor, call them superpowers or giants on the planet. And then now we only talk about South Korea and Taiwan. Where did we miss the boat? What happened? And what's the implication of it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, to the spirit of the question, we've definitely missed the boat in manufacturing. However, in chip design, the US is still number one, thankfully. And so, we have most of the high-end products are designed here in the US. And, we have the top chip designers in Apple, Nvidia, Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, etc. And that enterprise is also very expensive, by the way. To the NRE for making an SoC on 3 nanometer is estimated to be around $1 billion, up from 500 million at 5 nanometer, up from 250 at 7, up from 100 at 12 nanometer. So 1 billion is still much better than 20 billion, but 1 billion is no joke. So that freezes out startups. If a startup wanted to make the SoC in the iPhone, it's just not practical. It also freezes out the low volume customers like the DoD, or the defense industry that wants to make 1,000 units or something, or 10,000 units or something, 100 units or something, but also needs like very high performance. So there are still challenges on the design side, especially for folks who are making low volume products. But I do want to flag that on the large high volume side, the US still has dominance, I would say, on the design side. So we thankfully kept that. And then on the manufacturing side, I believe, one of many different opinions, that we just got very used to the benefits of globalization. So if you have Asia doing your manufacturing, but you're doing all the software stuff and all the design stuff, and you're able to sell at much higher margins by that division of labor, and you're able to make a more efficient system by not having redundancy everywhere. That you know that seems to be a good idea, and it was a good idea for actually a very long time. So in a sense, it was almost deliberate, I think, that we could shed the capex heavy things and push them to regions of the world where economically it made more sense, and we could do the high end design heavy work here in the US. the issue is that, the most efficient system is not necessarily the most resilient system. And we're finding that out now, where resiliency is just as important or more important than efficiency. So that's the one small detail that we didn't freak out enough about early on. And I think now we're starting to do that. So that's good.
How do you see the world evolving, let's say over the next 5 or 10 years? Because in semiconductor, we're not talking months, right? Months is peanuts anyway.
Yeah.
We go from 37% share in the world to 12% share with
Yeah.
all geopolitical stuff that's happening and potential for other conflicts around the world.
Yeah.
You think we need a reset? I mean, we really need to think. I mean, even if we move further into national security, national sovereignty type issues, and I'm not talking launching nukes and all the kind of stuff. I'm specifically talking about our water supplies, our utilities. They're all pretty much backed by a chip. It may be a $10 chip, it may be $1,000 chip, but there is a chip sitting somewhere. And yeah, does it really scare you? What do you see from a, yes, globalization happened, but now we are feeling the brunt of it, but it could even go further negative, or do you think that's just a little bit scare tactics on a few folks' mind?
Oh no, I'm scared. I mean, I think we should all be scared to some degree. I mean, if um, I'm sure everybody's heard the hypothetical China going into Taiwan, or something kind of disrupting supply chains like that would be massively problematic. The flip side of that, though, is we we created we created the first nuclear bomb, from nothing, because we had to. There was an emergency, there was a crisis. We got the best minds in the country, we put them somewhere, and they ended the war. We heard that Russia went to space, and we made a space program, and next thing we were in space, and not just that, we had a man on the moon. We had a global pandemic that was killing millions of people, and we made a vaccine in a few weeks. So the flip side is, it sucks that we always wait till there's a crisis to make these breakthroughs. But the American spirit is such that whenever we are pushed and our backs against the wall, and there's something this critical, this important, as long as the education has happened, as long as people are aware of the stakes, we usually kind of rise to the occasion, and we usually do kind of do the impossible. So I'm an optimist. I think the stakes are very high. I think that it is a real problem not to have a decentralized, or at least a less centralized supply chain in chip manufacturing. And I believe that it's quite possible to solve that over the next 5 to 10 years, if the will is there, if the urgency is there, and if people see this as another Manhattan Project or Apollo moment, then I think we can do it. So, but if we are complacent, we're slow, or we don't take this as seriously as we should, I think there's big problems.
Well, let's talk about the optimistic, Debo. So, what do you think the industry is going to do or react for all the challenges we have talked? I do like, and yes, this has kind of somehow become our modus operandi. Till our back is towards the wall, we don't do, I shouldn't say anything, but kind of true. What do you think, or how do you expect the industry to react? I know there are some small things already being talked about, fabs coming in, et cetera, et cetera. Talk about them, but beyond that, do you see any structural changes coming into this industry, be it manufacturing, be it technology? I think you play in that space, or any other factors. How do we
Yeah,
get out of it, per se?
yeah, great question. So I think the US is just behind, just in terms of capacity. Like, we don't have enough fabs that can build the kind of advanced chips that we go to TSMC to build in Taiwan. And so you can already see the wheels in motion. Intel is doing a great job pushing to build out more capacity, to add more fabs. And also TSMC and Samsung have started coming to the US, have announced plans to come to the US, to start building in Arizona and in Austin. And so I would say like kind of phase zero of phase one is, just build more capacity of, of as advanced of fabs as you can build in the US, get the muscles kind of going, get more capacity here. And you do that by getting the top companies. There are only three of them that have the ability to build these kinds of fabs: Intel, Samsung, and TSMC. And those three companies are already announcing fairly massive investment plans, 20 billion, 100 billion here, to build out more capacity, and a bunch of those are going to be in the US. So I think that's a great phase zero, phase one. And the CHIPS bill, which is, very close to being completely ratified, is a step in the right direction as well. There's $50 billion. A bunch of it is intended to spur this kind of capacity. So I think that's good. I don't think that's enough, because we said that, one fab is $20 billion. So if you have $50 billion, you can build two fabs, two and a half, and then you have to replace them in 2 years, 3 years. Like, it's clearly not enough to just build fabs, and it's also not sustainable. And it's also just not the American way of doing things. What we do is we invent things, we innovate, we improve things by 10x, we improve things by 100x. So I think that when you're behind, you obviously have to do things to catch up, and I think we have to build more capacity. But I think we also have to invent our way out of this. We have to get on a path that is 10 times less expensive, 100 times less expensive, which you only get through innovation. So we need to look at the current paradigm, and we need to say, is there a way we can do things differently? And we need to make sure that a chunk of the 50 billion or venture money or any other capital that's flowing into the space, we want to make sure a chunk of it is going to placing bets on very, very disruptive ideas, which may not work, but if any of them worked, could really have the US leapfrog, not just catch up, but leapfrog the rest of the world in manufacturing. So I think the way out is to definitely invest in a base of capacity, but it would be a big mistake to only do that. We have to definitely place bets on disruptive technologies that address this core problem of how can we get Moore's law without spending $20 billion.
That makes sense, Debo. Debo, you talk about innovation, right? And I would 100% agree with you that just catching up and a Me Too kind of doesn't get you out of the problem. What are some of the innovations, given you sit at the core of it, that actually excite you? Not just what you are doing, but things that are happening around you that give you this optimist confidence that we can innovate our way out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give kind of like, maybe three angles, one of them being Kepler. But I think the first wave of this was when people realized, you know what? I mean, all of computing is usually driven by the application. There's something somebody wants to do. There's some way you make somebody's life better, and the current computing capabilities are just not powerful enough to handle it. So an architect or the chip manufacturer decides to make a better way of doing things, and that's how computing progresses, and that's what drives demand for the industry. So things were flat for a while until kind of AI showed up, and AI, started making really big breakthroughs around 2012, and then it was just very clear that this thing was so compute hungry, but also could be very transformational. And if you just kept using CPUs, you would have server farms as big as the country, and that's not doable. If you just kept using GPUs, you would consume a lot of power as well. And so, just to show you how dramatic this is, a software company, Google, decided to build its own chip to like tailor specifically tailored for AI, the TPU. I would say that was like a watershed moment for disruptive ideas in the computing industry. You had a software company that built an application specific integrated circuit, an ASIC, just for AI. And if I'm not wrong, they actually did it in like 18 months or something, very quickly, um, and had it running in their data centers. So what they did there was an architecture. They pulled the architecture lever. So, one way you can innovate is to pull on the architecture lever. They said, hey, there's this workload that's really, really, really power hungry, and it's actually growing in its importance over time. And we need to do something about this. And we're going to design an architecture. We're going to say all these 50 billion transistors, instead of having them do 50,000 different things like in a CPU, we're going to have them just do one thing, which is AI. So we're going to get this huge speed up in performance. And that we've scratched the surface of. Of course, they're now like 50 to 100 AI chip startups after that. But I think the overall idea of, hey, let's look at the next workload that's coming up, and let's build an architecture specific to that, is a very interesting paradigm. And you see this with AI, you see this with Bitcoin. There's application specific circuits for that. You'll see this in the future in security applications like homomorphic encryption, some biology related applications, etc. So that's one area that I think is very interesting, where people are making architecture specific innovations. The other one is in packaging. So you've probably heard a lot about packaging, and actually this is somewhat referenced in Moore's original paper. The idea is that you can't afford the $1 billion to design on 3 nanometer, but maybe you can afford 12 nanometer for the bulk of your designs, and you can kind of share costs with someone else on 3 nanometer. So people are building these chiplets that, a little piece, the piece where you really care about performance and so on is done on a more advanced node, and the piece where you don't really need, it doesn't scale that much, it's an analog part or something, you can do on an older node. So these definitely will have their place in the future, and the packaging industry is definitely going to play more and more of a role, especially if you think of more radical innovations that will happen. You may want to have those new funky types of devices on a separate chiplet, and your more conservative CMOS stuff on a different chiplet. So in the future, packaging is definitely going to play a big role, and this is an area where the US should definitely step up, and Intel is doing great work there to own.
So, Debo, this brings me to a new question. I've never worked in a fab, but I've worked in designing products. So
Yeah.
life was easy. We came up with an idea, talk to somebody, lay out a PCB, put some parts on it, voila, then make a box and the product is ready. What's the problem? You have a wonderful idea. What is the challenge in actually bringing those chips to the market? Why can't we have prototypes? Why can't we have MVPs? We talk about those things all the time, 3 week to MVP, 4 weeks to agility, and all that kind of stuff. Why is it that the most important industry, we hear about them, but then what is stopping you from bringing this to the market?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I actually, my background's in physics, but I actually started a software company before I co-founded Kepler. And some days I just envy I envy the software startups. You can think of an idea, you open up your laptop, you type some characters in, and in a few hours you have an MVP. Um, and I did that personally. I built so many products in a few hours. I got them out, got them tested by users, grew them, and it's just not that way in hardware, and then especially in semiconductors. And it's specifically for this reason I highlighted that the costs of capex are just so high that you have only a few centers that have the tools that you need. To qualify though, if you have a really good idea and if you have a good team, it's reasonably it's the difficulty isn't too high to get very early prototypes. Okay, to go to a university lab to make small scale demos where all your devices are really large, they're micron sized devices or hundreds of nanometer sized devices. That's actually not too bad. And we have a good kind of university research ecosystem, as well as good kind of contract vendor kind of ecosystem where you do need a little bit of capital. But here we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars to a million to a few million dollars for a new venture to kind of just get started. And you can also get grants, etc. So I think the place where you're using really old technology to just prove out a concept is probably okay, I would say. Now, the gap is when you want to take this early proof of concept and mature it a little bit more, because your early proof of concept is not going to get you a customer. A customer is going to say, does this work in a real fab? Does this work when you scale all the dimensions down, etc. So because there's very huge risk, it costs $1 billion to design an SoC. Nobody wants to try something that hasn't been proven and lose $1 billion. So the gap is this sort of lab to fab space, if you will, where you have to go to an Intel, or you have to go to Global Foundries, or you have to go to TSMC, or you have to go to an Applied Materials. You have to go to one of these big companies that have the fabs you need to prove your idea at the scale required with the right environment required. And there it's really an opportunity cost problem for those companies, right? Like, why should my fab space is extremely precious. My fab time is extremely precious. I'm basically printing money. There's a chip shortage. Everything I make is going to sell. Why would I make any access available for something that honestly may not work? So, and I completely empathize with the big companies. So having some structure that incentivizes access of course we should build more R&D centers, we should build more capacity that allows startups access them, but those won't come on for a couple years even if we start building them now. But we have fabs today that, if we were to incentivize them appropriately, would probably be able to make some capacity available to startups. So we've been fortunate to be able to get access at some fairly large partners, but it wasn't easy, and we had to, do a lot of be very creative to get that access. But there are tens and hundreds of startups that are not as fortunate, and I think this is a place where the government, through the CHIPS initiative, can really help give the right incentives to these incumbents to reduce the risk that they're taking, by allowing startups prove out their technologies at a more advanced stage.
So, Debo, that brings me to my next question. We have this CHIPS Act coming through. There is some money out there. If you had to give advice to our policymakers on behalf of the startup community, i.e., the semiconductor startup community that has the same needs as yours, what could they do? How could they use? Because Purse has a lot of power out there. What would be your advice to our policymakers, or suggestion, or request?
Yeah, I mean, I think the highest level thing is to definitely prioritize innovation as part of the solution, because it's just a completely wrong thing to do, to take all of the funding and all of the energy and just point it at only at the existing way of doing things. I think pointing it at the existing way of doing things is a critical component, but it can't be the only way we think about this, because it's just basic math that there's no amount. A fixed amount is not enough. We need something that jumps us 10 to 100x. So at a highest level, people need to understand that innovation is not a nice to have. It's not something where you just make an R&D center and call it a day. It is a critical part of the solution. It is the reason we came out of the COVID pandemic. It's because somebody invented a vaccine. It's the reason we went to space. It's the reason we ended the Second World War. So the mindset just has to be there that innovation is critical. And then once you have that mindset, honestly, a lot of it is easy. You just have to listen to the startup ecosystem, and there are lots of experts who can help filter what's noise and what's signal. And the policymakers and whoever is actually going to be running these initiatives need to engage with folks like me, engage with other startups that are deeply embedded in solving this problem, who deeply care about the country as well, and have been coming at it from a very different angle. And I think once the priority is there, that this is important, and that's shown in the dollars, and once there's very sincere engagement with the startup community as the policies are being formed, I trust that the right thing will be done. But I think the biggest error that we can make here is to have the mindset that the startups and the innovation are kind of a nice to have secondary thing. Thankfully, I'm encouraged by the reactions that I'm getting. There are major chip makers, major foundries, and like very relevant kind of policymakers that are very interested in the Kepler story, and so that's encouraging. So I feel like the government's going to do the right thing on this one.
Thank you, Debo. So, by the way, even before we move forward, I'm super excited and waiting to see what you guys come up with. Danish, you have a question, and I think I'm going backwards. You have a very interesting technical question. You are on mute. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Debo. Hi, Bharat. Can you folks hear me fine?
All good.
Okay. So, Debo, what we have noticed that there are multiple startups in the chip design area across logic, across memory, across analog, and there is very less integration with the manufacturing world. And the question was like, how important do you think is informing the design and prototyping phase of chip development with the success factors from the downstream, that is the fab, assembly, packaging, test, and reliability? Currently, what we perceive is that it is perceived as an efficiency lever, a good to have kind of linkage. Do you think it's a key ingredient for success and delivery of the leadership products on time to the market for design house startups?
Yeah, I think the question is kind of like this kind of DTCO, like sort of like, how important is it to inform the upstream design work with considerations that are downstream in order to deliver best-in-class products? I think it's very critical, especially as we get into these this age where improvements are not as easy to come by. You can't just kind of throw it over the wall and assume that the process is going to give you all of the boost. So today, in many applications, you have to really understand what's happening at the transistors, what's happening, what the constraints of the process are, how things are going to be tested, and even now you have to even consider, given how crazy supply chain is, you have to even consider maybe as a first order thing, what's actually available in the what's available in the time frame that you need, what parts are available, and use that to inform the design of the system. So before, you would just design stuff and assume that you could get whatever parts you needed, and now you might have to say what parts are available and then have that inform your design. So even all the way up to kind of what's available for ordering, I would say it's really important. But yeah, at the lower level, I think it's really critical, and the best companies are definitely getting an advantage from thinking this way.
Thank you, Debo. Thank you, Danish, for your question. Alok, please go ahead.
China has this goal of achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency. So just wondering of your opinion, like how you think about that, if they can achieve that, and how long it will take them to achieve that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think they can. I think anyone who really, it's just a question of will and determination, just like the U.S. can achieve this. I hope that the um, I I hope that we take it as seriously as they are. They're spending a lot of money to do it. They're making a lot of progress. I don't know. I don't have like on the ground information beyond sort of what we all see, but I suspect that they can. I, I guess I would answer it this way. As the U.S. and as the West, I would plan for that to be an eventuality. I would plan around that. I would assume that in the next 10 to 20 years, China is able to sustain itself um, uh, to attain semiconductor self-sufficiency and kind of plan around that. I would not assume that they can't achieve it because I don't see any fundamental reason why they can't.
Thank you, Debo. Debo, Niranjan has a very interesting question. And Niranjan, please go ahead. It's not about your science, it's about economics. But I think it's an interesting question that you should take. Niranjan, you're good to go.
Great talk, a very interesting one. So my question is, I'm just a little bit thinking. So as a lot of investments is happening right in US and also Europe for these fabs. So my question is, can the end users afford, because eventually all the costs, probably all the companies might pass on the cost to the end users. So I'm thinking for a phone, if I'm paying $1,000 today, will I be paying like $2,000 or $3,000 more in the future? I'm just curious to know what the costs.
Right. And Niranjan, if I could add on your question, Debo, does it really mean that if all semiconductor manufacturing comes stateside, your DRAM, your SSDs, your processors, is it going to be cost competitive, or are we going to be paying through our nodes?
Yeah, so I mean these are good questions. So I think the reason you want the government involved is to help with this. Semiconductor manufacturing is actually, I don't know if it surprises people, but it's actually very highly automated. You go through the fabs and it's just essentially robots doing a lot of the work. So, labor differentials, land differentials, these things are important. But with a reasonable subsidy from the government, you're not going to be paying through your nose for sure. If you just do a one-to-one comparison, it'll be a slight increase, but again, this can be absorbed by government subsidies to a large extent. I think the bigger driver to your first question is it's the age-old question of like, what are we going to do with all these computers? Like, if we get all this computing power, what are we going to do with it? I am very confident that human beings will always figure out what to do with more computing, more intelligence. I mean, just think about it, right? Like what you get with computers is intelligence, essentially. And what would I do with 10x more intelligence? I could certainly use that, right? So we can't really forecast exactly what that computer that you're spending $2,000 on is going to look like. It may not even be a phone. It may be some other form factor. I promised I was going to throw in metaverse somewhere in this conversation. So, you just never know what that form factor would be. So I think the challenge is on us who are designing these systems to be creative, to capture the imagination, to use the raw computing power we're getting in new, interesting ways that continue to add value. And if you add value, I don't think there's a real limit on how much people will pay. So if we just keep making the same thing with all these fabs and all these advancements, then we may have a problem. But for the past 50 years, we haven't had that problem. We've always figured out a new thing to do with computers that customers are excited to spend money on.
Thank you, Debo. Ranjan, great question. We have one more question, or a couple of more questions. Alex, please go ahead. So Debo, while Alex is coming on, I'll just read his question. He wants to know what role, if any, do emerging markets, not previously big players, play in the semi-manufacturer space going forward? Or is there even a place for them, given the capital intensity that's required?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that we already have certain pockets where something like packaging is sort of surfacing in pockets outside emerging markets. I think that's a good area that people can kind of grow expertise in and specialize in. We also have pockets for chip design, which chip design looks a lot more like software than manufacturing. So that's, in India, for example, that's a huge center for that. And that's something I think can continue to proliferate more in emerging markets. I think also that R&D, early stage R&D for more innovative semiconductor work can also be, emerging markets can play a pretty big role there. But I think to really put a stamp in the space and, like, for example, build a production foundry, it would be better to couple it with a breakthrough innovation that really bends the cost curve for these emerging markets. So similar to how, most countries in Africa didn't necessarily have very large landline penetration, but then mobile phone came and it was a radical enough innovation that penetration there is as high as anywhere in the world. And so with a breakthrough in semiconductor manufacturing that radically reduces the cost, then I can see even more aggressive role being played by more emerging market countries. So I think there's a role to play, just modulated by how much capital the countries are willing to invest. And if it's not that high, there are still pockets like packaging and R&D and chip design where countries can definitely help make our system more resilient.
Debo, with the mobile, last question. If take yourself out of your innovation hat, if you were sitting at a Ford or a Barbie doll house or any of these companies that are using chips, what cards do they really have right now? I'm not talking about 2 years from now, right now, to get their chips. Or they have none.
They have to call Morris Chang, Pat Gelsinger. They have to call. I mean, I think right now they have to be pretty smart about setting expectations with customers, doing a better job of planning their inventory, prioritizing using old chips where they can, prioritizing which SKUs actually need the latest and greatest chips. And so if they can minimize the volumes that they're looking for, then it's just a question of trying to play all the cards you can to prioritize yourself. So prepay as much as possible, make the financial terms with the foundries better, fly to Taiwan. It's really just brass knuckle stuff like that. It's a really tough situation. Yeah.
And with this, Debo, I would like to thank you for spending your time and sharing all your thoughts with our guests. With this, I'll just wish you all the luck and great advances. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Bye.